Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carrie Newhoff here, along with David Kinnaman. For those of you who are brand new to the podcast, welcome. We still have leaders discovering it all the time. And I'm so excited to be with you again this week, David. We have covered a lot of territory over the last year, haven't we?
We really have. What a year. I said this before on the podcast, but it feels like I've spent the last 25 years practicing for this year of social research. So quite a crazy set of experiences.
Well, and we've also talked about cascading crises, the crisis within the crisis. And I'm excited in a few minutes, we'll welcome Nona Jones on. But it is the 1 year marking of the murder of George Floyd. And so we want to talk about that and where we stand with race relations, racial equality in the church. David, what's the data telling us before we bring Nona in?
Well, there's a few things we want to say. And first, as a researcher, one of the things that's been one of this consistent patterns for me is sort of seeing in the data other people's experiences. So, over many, many years, but especially the last 5 or 6, the different experiences, lived experiences of people of color, especially Black Christians, and then my experience as a white Christian. And it's been one of those things that's really stared me stared me in the mirror of what I understood, what I thought I understood. And so I think research has a lot of limitations, but among the things it can really help us do is see someone else's point of view and experience. So just broadly speaking, Barna continues to make efforts to broaden its efforts, broaden its set of research. We've got a couple big studies that are coming out or have come out this calendar year, 2021. One is called Trends in the Black Church, and then another called Beyond Diversity. And I'll mention a few stats from both those. So first, from Trends in the Black Church, we asked a question that was worded this way: being associated with a Black church is comforting because it is a place where Black people have control over their lives. Do you agree or disagree? And 2/3 of all Black adults, whether they attend a Black church or not, agree with that. So 2 out of 3 Black Americans agree with the statement: being associated with a Black church is comforting because it is a place where Black people have control over their lives. And that number grows to 80% among those who attend a historically Black denomination, a church associated with historically Black denomination. So, that's just a huge data point related to this experience of Black Christians in America. And again, just goes back to this theme for me as a researcher of trying to understand and experience the kind of issues and, sort of seeing someone else's faith. We believe all the same things, but our lived experience can be so different, comparing white to Black Christians in America.
Yeah, that's a new thought for me. I'll be anxious to see what Nona has to say about that. But what's the second data point you've got for us?
So the other thing we've been discovering in this study called Beyond Diversity is different ways that people think that sort of racial dynamics can be improved. So the question in the survey was, how can you as an individual improve racial dynamics in our country? Practicing Christians, which are predominantly white, most commonly say by building friendships with people outside of my racial group, or by teaching that the Bible encourages special kindness to marginalized groups, or finally, by supporting the economic thriving of people of color. But that's way down the list. It's only 34%. But among people of color, Asian, Latino, Black Christians, there's a lot of different kind of hierarchy. So it's not just relationships that matter to people of color, Christians of color. It's some of these other things: by supporting the economic thriving of people of color, by advocating for people of color in leadership positions. So there's more involved than just being friends. So kind of the summary is, among us white Christians, we sometimes think that if we're just friends with people of color, that's going to solve some of those racial issues. But if we're going to look beyond diversity and go deeper, we have to look at ways we're going to meaningfully empower people of color to lead the church, and looking at some things like, economically supporting, people of color, economically investing in this, and encouraging other ways of leading in more sort of meaningful roles. So these 2 studies are just a tip of the iceberg in terms of things that we've been studying, and ways that Barna is trying to show up with a lot of humility and working across a lot of different amazing researchers, people of color who are researchers who have joined us on these projects. And again, just commitments we're making as a team to try to help bridge this data gap in our company of trying to help support the whole church. So we're honored to do it. We still have so much room to grow, but these two studies, Trends in the Black Church and Beyond Diversity, are places to start.
Well, and people will want to probably go deeper. And if you want to, you can go to barna.com/beyond diversity. And you can order that report there. If you use the promo code ChurchPulse15, you'll get a discount as well. Maybe with that said, should we invite Nona in? For those of you, I think most leaders know who Nona is. She is an author, a nationally renowned speaker, currently serves as the head of global faith-based partnerships at Facebook. She is an expert at the expanding the influence of the gospel through social technology. And Nona, really, really good to have you this week on Church Pulse Weekly. So, okay, good thing this isn't live. Hey, Nona, can you pop in?
Yeah, it's saying I can't start my video because the host has stopped it.
David, come on, let her in. Joe, can you let Nona in?
There we go.
Sorry, Nona. Was nothing you did, okay? Just so you know.
I was feeling very punished for a moment.
Yeah, it's like, what did I say? What did I do? How did I look at the camera? Anyway, it's all good. Okay, I think we can just do a quick edit there. Don't worry about it, Joe. It's all good.
No, Joe, you should worry about it. That is the last mistake you'll ever make.
Well, David's your boss. So there you go. Okay, here we go. Nona, I know there were some surprises for me in the data, and even in the I thought the questions were really interesting. Any comments or reflection on what David shared?
Yeah, I actually was not surprised by the results. And I think part of the reason why I wasn't surprised is when you understand the historical context out of which the Black church emerged, it would make sense that people of color would feel safe and empowered in spaces that are filled with people who look like them. And I think it also makes sense that the idea of economic reparation is definitely important because economic inequity is what has existed the entire history of African Americans in this country. And so, yeah, I wasn't surprised by it. I was very glad that the data illuminated that we do have a problem. One of the things that, with Faith and Prejudice, our organization has been looking at the data in terms of the way that white Christians and Black Christians view things. And we saw a statistic that said 80% of Black Christians believe that America has a race problem, but 70% of white Christians don't agree with that. And so, Amos 3:3 tells us, how can two walk together unless they're agreed? So I think that fundamental disagreement is very problematic.
Yeah, and I think the data that Barna and others have produced over the last year in particular really shows how wide that gap is. If you showed me that 2 or 3, like, would that have surprised you to know that 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Nona?
Oh, yeah, because, if I'm honest, so I did not grow up in a Christian home, but I was invited to join a church. I was invited to go with a friend of mine in middle school to go to a church. I was a Black child. She was a Black child. Her mother was a Black woman, but the church was predominantly white. And so I actually grew up in a predominantly white church, and I would have never guessed that there was such a chasm of just ideological difference between Black Christians and white Christians. I just would not have known that. But now that I kind of reimagine and rediscover my own experience as a Black Christian, I do see where there were some subtle things that happened that, I just didn't realize had racist undertones. I didn't know because I had no point of reference.
Well, we are coming up at the 1-year anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. What's changed over the last year? How have things gotten better or perhaps worse when it comes to race across the country?
I think there's definitely been an awakening. And it's funny because I use that word and I think that word has been weaponized where people have said, oh, now you're trying to be a woke Christian. And it's like, well, when you don't realize what's happening around you, that is a form of intellectual slumber. And so if there's another word you want to use to describe it, when you are awakened to truth, I think there has been an awakening at the same time. And I'm sure, David can speak to this. I think there's also been an incredible amount of pushback for many white Christians who have said, I think I saw a stat that you all actually shared, where over the last year, I think white Christians' affinity to act on injustice has actually declined, which is kind of mind-boggling, But I do think that that's been a bit surprising. In my mind, in my heart, I felt like, wow, if people only knew, they would definitely want to take action, because that's what the Christian ethos is about, faith with works. That's what we believe. And yet what has happened on the flip side is I think we've had people say it's not about, seeking justice. It's about having people cast their cares on Jesus, which essentially ends up being a very passive type of faith. So it's been a very interesting year, to say the least.
We've known each other for a little while. Can I ask you a personal question?
Of course.
When you know that there's a big gap in indifference, what does that feel like to you?
It's absolutely heartbreaking. It's truly, truly heartbreaking, and it's devastating. And I think for me, since launching Faith and Prejudice last year, I walked into it somewhat naive. I got the vision from God to create a platform to bring the church together to confront systemic racism. And I just assumed that, of course, everyone's going to want to come and do this because we want to be the hands and feet of Jesus. And what I found in response was this apathy. And it wasn't even just apathy, it was hostility. This idea that how dare you say that, there's been oppression of Black people? How dare you say that law enforcement has any bias toward Black people? Blue lives matter and all this. And it really, it's one thing to hear that, I think, from, the world, right? It's like, okay, but when you hear it from people who are supposed to be your Christian brothers and sisters, it's gut wrenching. And I've kind of gone through the mental exercise where I'm like, okay, if something was to happen, I have 2 boys, they're 11 and 8. If something was to happen to my 2 boys, how many of my friends, who I assume are friends, would find a way to justify it? And that's the part that I think is devastating, because I put myself in the shoes of these mothers whose children are gone. And it's like, for what? For what, right? Because they made the wrong move, or because they rolled over wrong, or I don't know. And so it's devastating. And I think it makes me have to guard my heart, because the natural human inclination becomes to not trust people. But I have to remember that there are so many people who are on the side of justice, and not allow the people who are the vocal ones to dominate the way that I see the church.
And just to back up, thank you for sharing that. The way you share that as a mom, and the kinds of things. Again, just I don't even have words for all that's going on in my heart, other than to say thanks for sharing that, and to recognize that it's a common experience. We see it in the data. That this was actually one thing 4 years ago or so that really just struck me. It's like the experience of Black Christians around police brutality was so different than white Christians. The expectations, the beliefs that it happens, and so how can people have such different lived experiences? Because they do, and that's something that I've been learning. Just to back up what you were saying, the data came back late last summer that people's attitudes towards racial injustice, there had been some progress made, but among those who were sort of recalcitrant, who were reluctant, resistant to sort of racial justice issues, there was actually a larger segment of practicing Christians and Americans in general who said that they were sort of against that or resistant to it. So there was almost like gains made and losses also seen. And I wonder what you think, as you've worked in the space now a bit, and we've now again sort of the 1 year anniversary, like, on the podcast, we talked a lot about almost a year ago, like why it was such a moment with COVID, and we were all sort of like our hearts were more open maybe, and our nerves were more frayed, and all that happened. But I wonder what you've experienced as to the reasons why you think maybe a greater percentage of practicing Christians might have become more resistant? Like, what are some things that we could learn about that, and what could we do differently, you think?
Oh, this is a good question. So with Faith and Prejudice, we have an Instagram channel, we have a Facebook page, and we share a lot of content that is meant to spark conversation, and it's really meant to provide a forum and a space for people to just be honest about how they feel. And as a result of that, what I've come to realize is part of the reason why people are so resistant is because when you start talking about issues of white supremacy, what you're talking about now gets into a question of identity. And what I mean by that is, so if we were to look at the various, inequities that are facing the Black community, so you've got health disparities, economic, education, criminal justice. If you look at those things on the surface, you would say, oh my gosh, Black people have a problem. And when you start to dig into the data and you realize that many of these so-called problems are outcomes that have been literally manufactured by policies, well, that creates another problem, which is this. If I believe that Black people are deficient in their character, and that's why they're having economic issues and health issues and education issues and criminal justice issues, what that does is that affirms the belief that white people are superior, just genetically and naturally. When you start to talk about systemic injustice, what you are saying is that that's not true. And so what I have found is that many of the people who have come against us, for example, when we talk about issues of white supremacy, what they're really coming against us for is that they feel like it's an attack on their identity, because it becomes about meritocracy. And it's this idea that, what do you mean I somehow was given an advantage? No, I was not given an advantage because of my skin. I am where I am because I deserve to be here. And if you say that I'm where I am because of policies that advantaged me, now you're saying that I am not better. And so you're getting into an issue of identity. It's no longer just about politics. It's no longer just about ideology. It's about who I am as a person. And that becomes a very difficult conversation, because now what you're saying, and people don't want to hear it, is, oh my gosh, you mean the system was actually rigged in my favor and that I'm not as good as I thought I was. So now you're getting into those issues, and that's a whole different conversation.
And how do you have a conversation in that space?
Well, what I typically do is my team does this as well, is I try to ask questions. I think part of where we fail is we're so quick to make statements and we're so quick to share data. I have actually told my team, do not go point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint. Ask a person, why do you believe that? How did you get to that place? What I have found is, if you ask why, if you ask how, at least 3 times, you always end up in the exact same place. Case in point, we made a post. This was back when Kyle Rittenhouse, he killed, I think, the couple of people, and everybody was talking about how this was horrible, this was a travesty, and that he was being, unjustly charged with a crime. And we made a post that was juxtaposing him with Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin, of course, this, Black teenager, the same exact age, Black teenager who was gunned down in his neighborhood. All he had was Skittles and tea. And there were so many people who said, oh, he deserved it because he was a thug, and they just were trashing him. But then on Kyle Rittenhouse's side, people were like, oh my gosh, he was a patriot. And so, we made this post again to spark conversation. And there were some people that said things like, how can you possibly make this comparison? This is apples and oranges. Kyle was protecting people's rights. Trayvon was just being a thug. And, we started to talk about George Zimmerman, the man who perpetuated it. And there was this one particular guy, I'll never forget this. He was like, well, George Zimmerman was Hispanic. And so when we started to drill down and ask, well, what made you arrive at that conclusion? We got to the point where he identified as German, et cetera, et cetera. But the point was that the man we were talking to didn't even know that. He was going off of what he heard, and he had all these ideas based on what he had heard. But by the time we finished that conversation, he said, I may not agree with you about everything, but I appreciate you for giving me some insight that I did not have. That's the approach that we have to take. Is we can't go with, let me tell you what this person said and what that person said. We need to first say, why is it that you believe what you believe? And let's just start there and let's have a conversation about it.
How do you find the energy to stay engaged in that conversation?
I'm laughing because it is truly grace. It is grace. And I will tell you, back in probably November 2020, I had a bit of a crying and shouting match with God, because I was like, Lord, I do not have what it takes to sustain this. I am tired of being called a Marxist and a socialist and a communist. And I'm tired of people saying, oh, y'all are just Black Lives Matter. And all. I said, I'm tired of it. And I'm tired. And God said to me, he said, first of all, he said, if you were driving, he gave me this vision. If you were driving down a busy highway and you saw a blind person standing on the side of the road with their cane, and you saw that they were about to step into the highway, what would you do? And I was like, I would pull over and I would help them. And he was like, exactly. Help my people because they are blind and they cannot see. And I've called you to this work and I'm going to grace you for this work, but you cannot allow them to just walk into the highway and get hit by the car. And when he gave me that vision, I was like, but Lord, this is exhausting. And he said, that's why I called you, because you cannot do this in your own power. And that's what we have to remember, I think, as Christians, is like, look, this work is exhausting. And the reason it's exhausting is because it's spiritual warfare. You know, Satan doesn't sleep. He doesn't slumber. And so he is stirring up strife and division 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. You know, it's like, we have to know that. And so the easy route is to just say, I'm not going to get involved. And you can have a nice, easy life. But the problem with that is there's going to come a day where we're all going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And we're going to have to give an account for what we did. And that's what keeps me on my toes, is when I stand before the judgment seat of Christ, I really want God to be like, you know what? Well done, my good and faithful servant. I know you're exhausted, but you stayed the course and you fought the good fight.
It's such an inspiring story, and the Lord is so kind and so personal in the way He shows us how to stay in what He calls us to. So that's an amazing story. Thanks for sharing it. So many of the leaders who will be listening will be in some of that same space in talking about these realities of racial justice or other very controversial things in terms of our political environment. I'm convinced that pastors are meant to lead their people to have a political theology, not just how to vote, for almost certainly not that, but how to think about our role as Christian citizens. And of course, there's broad range of perspectives about that. What would you say to a leader who's trying to, deal with these questions of factfulness, half-truths, sometimes perpetuated through social media and other factors in our society? How can they hope to have a better word in this moment?
Yeah, I think it's so important as leaders that we are connected to the source. We cannot spend all day on social media arguing with people. We cannot, spend all day on the phone arguing with people. What we need to do first is have a prayer life. Like this work, like I said earlier, it's spiritual warfare. So we have to have a prayer life so we can stay connected to the source and we can be continually receiving downloads of grace. I think the second part is we have to be committed to it. And what I mean is, it's not enough for somebody to say we shouldn't do it and we stop, right? Like there are going to be people who are going to say, I know of pastors who did this, because in my work with Faith and Prejudice, we work with many churches. They've said, listen, we can't be a part of this because people have told us if we keep talking about race that they're going to leave. And my thing is, well, if someone is telling you not to do what God has told you to do, and they're going to leave you if you keep doing it, sounds to me like those aren't your sheep, because your sheep know your voice. And if you have heard from God that this is what you're called to do, speak it. And the goats will leave. I promise you, the goats will leave, but the sheep will stay. And so we have to, as leaders, just be mindful of that and just know, yes, it's hard work, but it's so worth it. Listen, we're talking about 400 402 years. I mean, the first enslaved Africans arrived in 1619. We're talking about 402 years that Satan has been given license over this land. Nazi Germany was a period of 12 years. We need to compare that, because I think sometimes people think, oh, it wasn't that long ago, and it's not that big of a deal. 402 years is a long time. And so we have to be committed to it. And again, if God, a lot of times people say, how do I know what God has called me to? You know what God has called you to because you have eyes to see the need and you have ears to hear. That's how you know. There are some people who they don't think there's a need. They don't think they need to get involved. But the reason why you have that compulsion in your heart is because God has created you for this moment. And don't allow any devil in hell to convince you otherwise.
What's changed in the last year that gives you hope?
Oh man, I have so much hope because people who quite literally would start off, calling our work all types of names have become some of our most ardent supporters. People who, they literally say, I've had, I was checking our Instagram earlier today, people thank you for not giving up on me. I had a couple emails from people earlier, thank you so much for not giving up on me. They would send us emails that said all types of crazy things, and we would just respond back in love and let them know, we're praying for you. And they're like, thank you for not giving up on me. That's what gives me hope is I see.
Seriously. Okay. This is a rare story. It sounds to me, I don't know whether you've had a chance to read it yet, but Adam Grant's new book, Think Again, which I would highly recommend. He actually, one of the most powerful stories in the book is of a African-American man who befriends a former KKK, Klansman, whatever their chief person is, he was one of them. And it's a powerful story, but it reminds me, your approach reminds me of what Adam Grant says is most powerful. Because you're right. If you throw stats and you just argue with people and it's my line against your line, it doesn't work, right? But you're not giving up on people. And I would say conversion on the internet to a different way of thinking is very rare these days, Nona, very rare. So if you've had 2 people, you're probably in the top 1% of people who convinced other people to change their mind on the internet. Can you give us some tips? Because faith and prejudice is such a big deal on Facebook. You have a huge presence. And I don't know, I find even on my channels, a lot of Facebook is angry these days. It's very angry. People are angry. Yeah. What are some keys to building authentic community around issues on social media?
I think motive matters. Motive really matters. So Faith and Prejudice, just to give you a little bit of backstory, it was birthed out of the fact that because I'm very privileged and blessed to get to preach in various racial and cultural circles, when George Floyd's murder happened, various pastors reached out and they were like, hey, will you send us a sermon on race or be on a panel about race? Will you do a podcast about race? And I was happy to do it, but I felt like the moment called for something bigger. And so God gave me the vision for Faith and Prejudice. So I launched it. We had 6 million people tune in for a week of conversations we hosted, which was awesome. But I realized even toward the end of that week that was just the start of it. And so motive matters. If you go into the work because and I've seen this, you go into the work because you just want to put your name on it. You just want to be like, I have held a conversation about race. You're not going to last very long because the people are going to come for you very quickly. And I've seen it happen. And I've seen people who started to go down the path totally retreat because their motive wasn't right. And so motive matters. Secondly, your approach really matters. So my team, even though, trust me, we love people, but people can be harsh. And so sometimes, the human side, the Peter side will rise up and we want to go back and forth, but we remember this isn't about us. This isn't about our feelings. This is about heart change. And so our approach, again, as I said earlier, is ask questions. What makes you think that way? Okay, well, do you really believe this? And well, how does that thought process square with what Jesus said here? And okay, well, tell us how that squares with what Isaiah said here. And so we're constantly just kind of prodding them along. Approach matters. And then I think prayer matters. Like you've got to stay prayed up every morning. I pray, God, please give me the grace and the compassion to carry out your will for faith and prejudice today. That matters because this is, again, it's a spiritual war. So I think, again, intention, your motive matters, your approach, as well as being prayerful. Those three things are critical.
I think that's such a good dialogue. We have had on several episodes of this show, just talked about exactly what you said. White pastors who said, okay, I'm going to jump in, because maybe in their hearts, they really care. And then, an elder resigns, people leave the church, donors withhold, people get mad. They're like, well, I can't, okay, I did it. Now I did my thing. And now I'm going to go back to the work of the church. I know I've asked this in a couple different ways, but I'm pretty amazed, Nona, to be honest with you. What keeps you from just being cynical or throwing in the towel or just becoming like, I'm not talking to these people anymore? Like what? That is a personal journey that I have tremendous admiration for.
I oftentimes reflect on Dr. King. I reflect on him. I reflect on, even people like Malcolm X. And I know sometimes they're like, oh, he was so radical. But towards the end of his life, he actually really started to align more with even what Dr. King was sharing. And I just think about the fact that I'm like, these people, they didn't have to do this. I mean, Dr. King was pastoring his own church. He ended up being thrust into leadership when the Birmingham bus boycotts took place, and they were meeting at his church. And then he became a spokesperson. And, it was not like he set out to lead the civil rights movement. And so I think about him often. I think about people like James Baldwin and Rosa Parks. And I'm like, these are people who didn't ask to be anything. And I'm similar. Like I'm good. I try to remind people, I'm like, listen, if I shut down Faith and Prejudice today, I'm good. Like, I love my job. I have a great family. I have a local church. Like, I'm great. But this is God's work. This is not mine. Like, I'm stewarding it, but this is God's work. And that's what keeps me going. Is it's like, look, they stayed on the course. I should be able to do the same as long as God has continued to call me. And if he decides tomorrow that he's going to give it to somebody else, then we'll make that happen. But that's what it is. It's not about me. And I should say that early on, I had a conversation with God, because I noticed that, as I said before, some people, they make it about them, and like, they want to be the face. They want to be I think I've kind of been the face, but that was never my intent. Like, it was never my intent for this to be the Nona Jones show. That's why even if you go on like our Instagram, you don't see like founded by Nona, you don't see any of that, because I want it to be focused on the mission, and I want it to be focused on the work. And I'm not trying to make a personality out of it, because all the glory goes to God.
It's a great perspective. What advice would you have for leaders who are trying to figure out how to speak about these topics on social media, right? I love, like, you've given us lots, and it's actually made me reflect on how I handle things online too, because it's easy just to block or delete or, whatever. And sometimes you have to do that.
Sometimes you have to.
Once in a while you do. But you seem to go the extra mile, which I really, really appreciate. But what about leaders who are like, hey, every time I post, about an incident, and unfortunately there probably will be another incident, right? Nona, maybe by the time this airs, there'll be another, people listen to it, there'll be another incident. But last time I did that, I got killed in public. And last time I preached on it, this happened. So what would you say to leaders that are losing their courage?
Listen, courage, the way I define courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is fear in the forward direction. We all have fear. I have fear, and that's just reality. But I also have a charge, and I have a mandate, and I have a mission. And that's what really helps me to overcome the fear. I would say that you cannot allow, because fear, again, it's a tool of the enemy. All right. God has not given us a spirit of fear. It's a tool of the enemy, and fear is used to silence the voices of people that God has commissioned to do his work. And so, yes, people are going to come at you. They're going to call you names. They're probably going to block you and cancel you and all that. That's okay, because God will handle that. God will handle that and God will take care of you. But keep being a voice and keep speaking. You'd be surprised. There are so many more. I get so many DMs from people who they will never make a comment on a post, but they say things like, thank you so much for saying that. I've been struggling with how to articulate this. And what you said just gave me the words. And so there are more people who want to do right than the people who are like, stop talking and be quiet. And, you know, and I would say this too, you know, sometimes we allow things like, you know, donors and members to silence us. But what if we were to take that posture with sin in general? Like we see that happening, right? It's like, don't talk about this sin, because if you do that, people are going to leave. And it's like, well, what is the point? Like if we're trying to get people to a place of relationship with Jesus, if we're trying to get people to eternity, we're going to have to talk about these issues. And Satan would love nothing more than for us to provide a watered down, diluted gospel that makes people comfortable in inaction. He would love that.
So I'd love both of you to take a crack at this one, David and Nona, because it's a little data related, but it can also be non-data specific. But love lives in every generation, so do hatred and bigotry in every generation. But do you see a difference in younger millennials and Gen Z when it comes to racial justice and reconciliation?
Well, from the perspective of the data, we absolutely do. Is a question I've been circling in my head here as I've been listening to you, Nona. And we see younger Christians, younger generations generally, but younger Christians especially being more interested in the church being an active part of racial justice conversations and actions. Now, it's not universal, even among younger generations. There's some good questions I think that people ask about whether young people will just grow out of that kind of sort of awareness and activism. We heard recently from when we did the Beyond Diversity webinar, this idea that people's investment in sort of racial injustice grows as they get older. They're increasingly invested in the systems that allow for them to sort of, as you said earlier, Nona, convince themselves that they deserve what they've gotten, right? So will younger Christians today, as they age, be more and more convinced that what they have gotten out of life, the sort of the wind at their back as white people in our society, that's a question we don't know until 10, 20 years hence. But I do think that if we're going to disciple young people, this would be my observation just as a parent of three Gen Zers. If we're going to disciple people, and all the research we see that Christianity has to matter in all of life, not just in the parts of life that seem the most buttoned down and sort of ready for our Christian work. And I think that younger generations, especially these resilient disciples that I spend a lot of time interviewing and trying to encourage, the 10% of young people who are the most committed to Scripture, church, Jesus, their work in the world, they want to see the church, have a holistic response to issues of racial justice.
Yeah.
Nona, what's your take on that?
You're exactly right. I've actually been counseling some pastors to realize, if your so-called strategy to reach the next generation does not include your church being an active shaper and molder of justice in your local community, I can almost guarantee you're going to lose them. Because this idea that I'm just going to church to sit and listen to a sermon and that's it, it's not true. Because what's important to them, I would say this, I'm a millennial. I would say that millennial Generation Z is a very activist generation because of social media. Like I think social media has created a level of awareness about inequity and injustice that people in prior generations were shielded from. It's like you didn't know unless you somehow just found out about it. But now, social media, like you're seeing this constantly. And then I think, and I haven't seen the hard numbers, but I do suspect that millennials and Gen Zers, they probably have very diverse sets of friends as well, because they're going to schools that are much more integrated. And so, I remember talking with some younger white Christians around the time when Trayvon Martin was killed. And they were like, one of my best friends looks exactly like him. And that type of just resonance with the experience, I think that changes the way that they see the world. And to your point, though, David, I think that's going to be really interesting, as you're right, is as they get older and there's more of a vested interest in the structures that do tend to benefit them, will they continue to adopt that activist posture? I personally think that they will retain it. And I believe that because I think the way of work has changed so radically that what was considered kind of a formal progression of your career is not quite the same anymore. And so there's less loyalty to, a particular place of work. And it's like, well, if you don't align with my values, then I'm not working here. Whereas before it was like, okay, do I want to aspire to their values? Now it's like, do they align with my values? And if the answer is no, I don't want to work here. So that's going to be really interesting.
Something you said, Nona, sparks a thought I've shared, I think on this podcast before, but in other places, that the power of smartphones, I'm sitting here with mine next to me, is such that we're now exposed to a broader world more quickly, instantaneously sometimes, and we're able to experience the lives of others in a visceral way, just like media and technology, from the telegraph to radio to television to sort of social media and digitization of content. And so I'm often, we talk to a lot of leaders, try to help them, especially navigate discipleship in what I call digital Babylon. And one of the ways I think about what you're saying is that if we don't have ways of teaching people to respond biblically, theologically to the things of our current culture, such as the images that are sent to us that we experience on Facebook, and other social media forms, that, for example, a theology of lament is so critical and a way of responding to the heartbreak that we see in the world. And so if the church doesn't have, and we do have these resources in Scripture and in Christian tradition and in the Holy Spirit, that we can respond in a deep, human, relational, gospel-centered way. But I see so many young people walking away from the church because it's almost like we give them a very simple response to these questions. And so our theology has to actually be enriched and deepened in order for us to meet the questions of our time. And I think that's a great opportunity for the church, but otherwise they will be discipled through the cultural issues. And I think this is actually why a lot of Christians sort of stick on things like critical race theory and Black Lives Matter or other things. It's like culture is trying to disciple because the church hasn't actually given us the language and framework to do the hard work of understanding some of these deep issues. But Scripture does have it. We have these resources within the Christian community. We have to turn to them. Otherwise, we're going to give people too thin a gospel to really be lived out.
Can I also offer, I think this is why we're seeing this move now across legislatures around the country in order to extract any teaching around racial injustice from school curriculums, and it's disheartening and it's heartbreaking because if you look at Germany, for example, it's a very fascinating juxtaposition. What we know historically is that Hitler actually studied the United States and the way that the United States was treating enslaved Africans and thinking about policies and practices to oppress the Jews in Germany. So we know that historically, that's well documented. And what's interesting, though, is even though that period of oppression was 12 years, there are so many restitution efforts in Germany, including the mandatory teaching of what happened. And there are so many ways that country is focused on making sure that the next generation understands the gravity of both what happened and how it was allowed to happen so that it doesn't happen again. And yet here in the United States, there's this idea that, well, if we just don't talk about it, then everything will be okay. And so it's unfortunate. And I think we're doing a disservice to the next generation because they need to know, like, how can you, I was running this morning and I was thinking about this, if a wife's husband was cheating on her, right? Like, we wouldn't just say, well, take her phone from her so that she can't go online and find out that he's cheating. Like that's not how you fix that. You fix that by addressing the cheating. And so we for whatever reason, just are deciding not to do what needs to be done to right the wrongs. And so I think there's some things we can learn there.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I was in Germany a number of years ago doing some teaching, spent some time just going from city to city over a period of a week. And, it wasn't about the Holocaust or the Second World War, but it was very interesting when that subject did come up. There was still, in probably 2 or 3 generations beyond those who lived in the 40s, a sense of deep regret and shame over what had happened, which is actually healthy. A sense of collective responsibility for the atrocities. And I think with that is a humility, not a self-righteousness, but a humility that comes with that. Wow. Well, this has been a wide-ranging, super helpful, I think, fresh take kind of conversation on this. So thank you so much, David and Nona. David, again, Barna has done extensive research on the issue of racial justice. So if you want to point people somewhere, where would you point them to?
Well, check out these 2 new reports, one called Beyond Diversity, and then another one called Trends in the Black Church. Those are 2 things that are out in 2021, and we'd encourage you to start there. Lots of stuff online about the differences in experience between Black Christians and other people of color who are believers and their experiences. And I think just as a helpful starting point, I think data is one way we can have a more meaningful or safe conversation about people's experiences. Even that can be emotionally charged, but at least it's one place to begin to understand it. And both of these new reports are really meant both for the communities they're directed to. I mean, so Trends Black Church helps, I think, Black leaders understand the Black church experience and how to lead the Black community forward. But it's also an important piece of research for all of us as Christians to understand what's happening and what we can learn from the spiritual vibrancy of the Black church. Black Americans are just so much more Christian than most white Americans. And so we have so much to learn from our brothers and sisters. And anyway, these 2 new reports are just a small contribution Barna is making to that conversation.
And that's barna.com. You can start at Beyond Diversity, so you can find it there. It'll be a gateway into things. Correct. Nona, Faith and Prejudice, tell us a little bit more. And do you have an event coming up that you want to share?
Yes. So June 17th through the 19th, we are hosting our inaugural Righting Wrongs Summit. It's going to be a fully online summit, 3 days where we are exploring the theological as well as the practical application of repentance, forgiveness, and conciliation. I don't use the word reconciliation because reconciliation presumes that everything was okay, something broke, and now we just need to go back. And in fact, we started off broke, so now we need to fix it. And so what we'll be doing is on the 3rd day, where we're talking about conciliation, we're going to be lifting up the actual work that individuals and churches can do to right the wrongs of racial injustice at the local level, as well as state and nationally. We have incredible speakers, people like Anthony Ray Hinton. He's a New York Times bestselling author. He was wrongfully imprisoned on death row in Alabama for 30 years for a crime he did not commit. But he came out of prison, and one of the first things he said is that he had to forgive the people who imprisoned him. We're also going to have a gentleman named Dr. Richard Harris. He's a former Grand Dragon of the KKK of Indiana. He is now an associate minister at a predominantly Black church in Florida. It is an incredible story, but we have about 15 speakers and research readouts and panels. I'm really excited about this. You can head over to faithandprejudice.com/summit to register. It's only $35, and 100% of the proceeds are going into the programming that we are going to be releasing to our local church partners in order to do the work of righting the wrongs of racial inequity in America.
Nona, thanks for your ministry. Thanks for your friendship. Thanks for what you're doing for the church and so many leaders. Really, really so grateful. And I know this won't be the last conversation. One question I've got for you next time we talk is, how do you get it all done, Nona? Come on. That's crazy, all the stuff that you're navigating. I know some of that backstory, but it's powerful. Well, I want to thank everybody for watching or listening today. If you're new to the podcast, feel free to subscribe and share it with a friend. These are really significant conversations. We also want to thank our partners at Subsplash. They are an all-in-one solution for every church. They've helped over 14,000 churches with their online presence over the last year. Another thing we could have talked about all day long, Nona, because you're a ninja in that area. You can visit subsplash.com/ChurchPulse to learn more, and by the Replicate Collective. I'll be participating this fall, along with many other leaders. It is a disciple-first tribe of church leaders who will help you fulfill your personal mission and the God-given mission of your church. You can go to replicatecollective.com to apply today, and spots are limited.